a visitor through the cultural unity of India as it existed over time and through the ages. I think there is a word in English for this. It's called neutronia, which is a counter history, as it were, which Gudev is trying to give us, and it certainly makes fascinating reading. I wish someone among us here or somewhere else would study this more carefully. To Gudev and fellow writers, this ensued from the Abrahamic insistence on monotheism, which tends to appropriate truth or reality for itself. The Hindu, by comparison, speaks not so much of monotheism as of monism, or a single order of truth and reality. For the Hindu, cause and effect are only functionally and falsely separate. Vivekananda, though gifted with a keen sense of history, found history problematic, inasmuch as it was susceptible to instability and revision. In his opinion, one reason why Hinduism has endured over the ages, whereas other faiths had faltered or collapsed, was because it did not rest on the idea of a single historical founder. Gudev argues that while egalitarianism is coveted socially, it cannot be found in a perfect state in any society. Indian society is indeed hierarchically arranged and yet allows space and autonomy for each of its constitutive units. According to both Gudev and Brahmabandhu, this is made possible on account of a creative combination of Odhikar Bhed, Varnashram Dharma, and Deshachar. All three, we are reminded, are based on a language, not so much of rights as of duties and obligations. Diversity can be effectively managed only through a carefully and realistically differentiated system of rights and obligations that accommodates a great variety in values and lifestyles, so long as they do not claim an equal share in social resources. Odhikar Bhed makes the point that beyond a certain point, men cannot be judged equally, for they are naturally indisposed to keep alive an undifferentiated system of rights and values. Varnashram Dharma, on the other hand, allows each group or sub-community to reinforce its own sense of autonomy and even draw a measure of pride from it. For a politically subjugated people, Gudev argues this is especially valuable. People who question the jati structure, argues Gudev, eventually turned into discrete jatis themselves. The Muslims too were a jati, whose everyday life was deeply intermeshed with Hindu life and thought. The Muslims of Malda district, he found, to be better informed about the Pandav brothers than the history of the Caliphate in Baghdad. Bengal Muslims, he further observes, were known to desist from eating beef until the revivalist programs of Sayyid Ahmad Bareilly in the 1870s and thereafter began to insist on it. Gudev, in fact, is one of the very few contemporary Hindu thinkers who had a word of praise for the Indo-Muslim administration. Unlike the British, he said, this administration allowed Hindus to assume the highest offices of the state. This administration had also contributed to Indian unity by promoting the use of Hindustani, which Gudev claimed, somewhat wrongly I think, was spoken by a majority of Indians. The Muslims, he concludes, were the foster children of Bharatvarsha, a people naturalized by virtue of their residence, if not by birth. Finally, egalitarianism had also to be qualified in view of Korno, which has to be individual as the operative unit. Deshachar, Gudev maintains, preserved the vital social fabric of the people. And it is interesting that they should privilege this even over Shastra or scripture. Interestingly, during the controversy over the widow remarriage question in the 1850s and after, Gudev found fault with the reformer Vidyashagar for relying on dubious scripture in preference to Deshachar, which did not permit widow remarriages. Universalism. Apparently, how are we doing on time? I think not sure.
You have about to say 15 minutes.
Oh, that's right. Apparently, there is a point at which claims about the unity of India expand into claims of universality. This appears to have been born in the twin agendas of contesting the racialism of the colonial state and truth claims made by Anglican Christianity. Especially after 1893, it was quite clear that even the growing enthusiasm for the study of comparative religion did not, in effect, treat all religions equally, Professor Bhattacharya's testimony to the fact that at the Chicago Parliament, Anglican Christianity did not send its representative because they did not wish to speak from the same platform as colonized Indians. Catholics came, but not Anglican Church. In Hindu Bengali culture, this universalism may be said to have been expressed in three different ways. This is a subject for greater study. I'll just sketchily go through this. One, the way of textual exegesis, which is, I think, best represented by Ram Mohan's work in 1829 called Universal Religion. It's a little book that he wrote. Synthetic fusion and creative eclecticism of Keshav Chandra Singh, the Brahmo reformer, who built the Navavidhan in the 1880s, and then finally the eclecticism of Sri Ramakrishna. And I'll speak more on the last than the other two. Especially in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, qualitative judgment of religion is discouraged. Man is simply not equipped to judge religions for the important reason that he did not create it in the first place. It is also this that negates an exclusive truth claim that one particular religion may make for itself. Swami Vivekananda explained how religious diversity is not contradictory but mutually complementary. Each religion, he argues, I quote, takes up one part of the great universal truth and spends its whole force in embodying and typifying that part of the great truth. It is therefore not addition, but exclusion. End of quote. This universalism not only respected all religious traditions, but also the boundaries that each tradition drew for itself. This appears to provide an autonomous grammar and vocabulary for every tradition. Hindustani ragas are all based on a common set of notes, but each with its own distinct movement and a combination of notes. Vivekananda put this very well when he said how the universalism that he had learned from his master, Sri Ramakrishna, was not simply tolerance, but perfect acceptance of each tradition. This scheme called for not one faith community, but multiple communities which shared their deepest and highest ideals, albeit conceptualized differently. Religions were like so many languages, each expressing the same truth differently. I will long also pondering over the question, and this is for members of this audience to give me some ideas about, as to why, ranging from Ram Mohan to Ramakrishna, thinkers have claimed that Advaita represents a quintessential thought of India. Now, as I know as a historian, Advaita was not necessarily the most privileged stream of Vedanta in pre-colonial times. But it certainly from the early 19th century down to the early 20th century suddenly erupts into great prominence. I'm wondering as a historian whether this is also a cultural strategy that certain Indians evolved in order to counter all kinds of allegations of disunity and so on. And it's certainly worth investigating as to why, within all substreams of Vedanta, Advaita takes this prominence. I don't know much philosophy, which is why I cannot really fully answer this question, but it is a question worth investigating. The Dharmic view, finally. The universalist thesis, as propagated by the Hindu thinkers of 19th century Bengal, was not merely religious or philosophical in intent, but also ethical. As is well known, this was first effectively formulated in the treatise Dharma Tattva in 1888 of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, where importantly, Dharma appears both as a system of duties specific to certain social groups. There is Jati Dharma, there is Stri Dharma, there is Apad Dharma, whatever. But it also includes a universal norm which subsumes and glosses over such specificities. So Dharma is also community specific, but it is also a norm that cuts across all divisions. It's certainly a unique rendering of the term Dharma because traditionally, as I understand it, Dharma was specific to certain groups or interests. The essence of Dharma, Bankim argued, is located not in the Vedas, but in the idea of social good. About a decade later, Swami Vivekananda told Rakhal, Swami Brahmananda, how doing good, I quote, doing good to the world is the only one true universal. From this perspective, the Dharmic view seems to echo the universalism that we have spoken of. It seems to reiterate the view that reality is a unified experience, an existence, and that to break this up into conceptual dichotomies and profess the claim that everything is relative can be utterly misleading. It is merely the empirical habits of our mind that leads us to believe that everything can be neatly categorized, whereas in truth, boundaries could indeed be fluid and fuzzy. The Dharmic view also appears to make three important statements to my mind. First, it demonstrates how truth cannot be appropriated by any one view or doctrine. Second, it is indeed, it suggests that if conflicts arise from one's relationship with oneself and with others, their resolution too must lie in those very relationships, since no human being can be perpetually be at war with the self or with others. Since conflicts cannot be altogether eliminated, the meaning of dharma lies in creating adequate individual and social spaces where conflicts may be amicably resolved. This allows individuals and groups to realize their potential and bring it to sublime fruition. Finally, dharma reinforces the view that the higher truth has to be realized through several discrete truths. Truth is indivisible, but also relational, to be socially lived and not merely known. In concluding, I sort of threw up two ideas. I was thinking about Purusharthas yesterday after I heard so many eminent speakers. It seems to me that of all the Purusharthas, the values, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, if you think carefully, dharma is the only one which is relational. The other three, karma, artha, and moksha, are individuated. And the highest individualism is to be found in moksha. Whereas dharma can be entirely different. Dharma is always in relation to others. It is never self-centric at all. So this is something which I want to elaborate upon when I begin to write this more carefully. In conclusion, let me end on this note. In a postmodern, post-colonial world, clearly the most fashionable term used today is pluralism. This is certainly consistent with the contemporary emphasis on democracy and equity, but also tends to overlook the fact that there is something innately human about being human. That all diversity and dissidence notwithstanding, we all share, or at least ought to share, the common goal of realizing one's potentiality as a human being. If indeed we need to persist with the idea of emphasizing the cultural unity of India, let us try and equate this with a genuine feeling of goodwill and empathy. I remember Swami Vivekananda's best, I don't quite remember the quote, but the substance of it goes like this, that you should feel from the heart. Let not the intellect guide you, because the intellect can go only up to a point, and beyond a point it cannot go. The more important thing is to feel from the heart. The moment you begin to feel from the heart, everything falls into place. And I think on that note, let me conclude by saying that this is a point where love, empathy, a genuine feeling for the other might be the new cultural norm that we can build upon. It is something not limited, but expansive and infinite. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sen. May I now call upon Dr. Sajjan.
We must have this replaced here. This is absurd. I'm trying to do a good thing. Professor Sajjan Nag, the discussant, to comment on this paper.
Don't be too critical.
I hope it's a paper which builds with ideas, and therefore difficult to understand, not hard facts. I think the paper basically deals with the issue of community formation, as I understand it, in colonial India, and the theoretical, intellectual, and the cultural inputs that has gone into the making of that community, which can be which in a way we are using the word community, but actually it meant nation formation. And I think in this very inputs of theoretical and intellectual input lies the paradox of the nation formation that we have had. I think Professor Sen divides his paper into three parts. In the first part, he tries to contextualize the issue and tries to say that how, when the colonizers encountered a vast diversity like India, how they tried to understood it, and they used their what Professor Sen calls cultural technologies, tries to understood it in those terms, but certain tools and idioms have been used, and very interestingly, what I found it very striking, he speaks that those cultural tools, those intellectual tools are so hegemonizing, the Indians too use the same kind of category in understanding their own institutions. Here, he tries to draw from Professor Parthicha's division of the inner and outer domain, where Chatterjee's notion is that we have allowed the outer domain to be influenced by the British, and the inner domain was not that much exposed to the thing, it was meant for us. Professor Sen takes it further and he says this inner domain is not such a hollow and thing, it is very, very layered, and therefore the subjectivity that was there, it has to be perhaps understood in terms of that multiple subjectivities, if I understand it correctly. Here, striking line which I found in the abstract is that here, for example, the concept of spirituality in colonial India has to be understood as a metaphor for culture, which I found very, very striking. Because we've been hearing of spirituality so much, and I'm sure in the next 1 or 2 days we're going to hear it more. So he kind of fixed it for us, how do we understand it. In the second part, Professor Sen tries to see the endeavor in 19th century and early 20th century, how Hinduism was tried to be projected as a universal religion. This has one advantage, it became all inclusive. Once it is projected as a universal, it was positive, and at the same time, Hindu could be used as an alternative for Indian nation. This is what I understood. And the second strategy which he talks about is the endeavor that whenever we try to transform the Indian community, Indian diversity into one jacket of nation, one point that should not be forgotten is the inclusiveness of state and society for the theoretician of 19th century Bengal, like he mentioned Budi, even Brahma, Upadhyay and all, that society has always taken, or social formation has taken precedence over political formation. Therefore, it has to be, any political formation cannot overlook the formation, and therefore I don't know whether society is the correct word for Samaj, but Samaj, Samaj has to be very part of that nation formation. Third, again very interestingly, is a third strategy, what he calls dharmic, that it should be an overriding concern of the nation formation. Therefore, nationhood or community formation should not be just a political entity, but also a cultural entity. The third part of his paper is a kind of affirmation of the thing. He detected that in the 19th century, there was a lot of discussion on, not so much on cultural unity, but unity in diversity. And again, very, very remarkably, he deciphers that the idea of diversity was a Hindu majoritarian concern more than anybody else, which is again very, very striking. Therefore, he also argue that it was historically necessary that that such a concern should emerge from the majority community. In other words, the project of nation making was as much a project of cultural unification. Indian nation unification was as much a project or modernist project of cultural unification. And what I understood perhaps is this is what he felt, that this very premise perhaps weakened the project of modern nation making. In a way, I see a sense that what he talks about, that in the entire trajectory that Indian national movement have taken place, the nation formation have taken place, there is a kind of a tacit disapproval that it took this way because of this kind of intellectual input and all that. It is also very evident there was a constant contrast between the intellectuals to distinguish Indian diversity, Indian civilization from European notions, European ideas of nation, for example. I think that brings, he has mentioned Tagore only once, but has not gone into that debate, is the very well whether the Eastern concept or Indian concept, for example, of Indian civilization would be incongruous with the Western concept of nation. I think he brings that debate very, very strongly into the fore. My issue here is two. Is one, the concept of inner domain remaining untouched by Europe. Is it so? Is it so? I mean, I have very strong reservations that even the inner domain, the so-called inner domain was perhaps not so much untouched. I mean, right from the age of marriage, age consent bill, to the Article 377 that we are discussing this so much now, everything was touched by the colonial thing. Where is that inner realm which has remained untouched? I mean, the age at which a woman should be married, the age of puberty, or all these were touched by the colonial, which aspect has remained untouched. The third is, the second thing I want to take, that the idea of unity in diversity was a colonialist construction in the sense that Vincent Smith has first propounded it. But isn't it a nationalist appropriation of a colonialist construction? That is what we need to debate perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nag. We have 5 minutes for discussion. Are there comments or questions that anyone would like to raise? I may remind you that,
I may remind you that we have also kept apart one entire session for a roundtable discussion, so that many of those who would like to discuss any particular point with the author of a paper in greater detail, it could be done at that point of time. But here, if there are questions which are important, could be raised.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. It is not my field at all, but I learn a lot from it. I want to know what is the basis for your interpretation and even translation of social terminology, jati, for example. You use it in a wider sense and from different points of view. Of course, I don't mean secondary literature, so I want to know, is it any basis or just your own understanding and teaching of this terminology?
Thank you. Yeah, if there's any more questions. I think given the constraint of time, we'll rest there, and
I request Dr. Sen to respond to the questions raised by Dr. Nag and Dr. Rajamohan.
Your first point, I didn't quite get the 3 points. I've got 2. The question of whether inner domain is at all untouched. Very interestingly, this argument that Europe represents the epitome of material advancement and India represents spiritual advancement, is something which Indians themselves, at least two Indians that I know of, dispute. One of them is Sri Ramakrishna. In the Kathamrita, Sri Ramakrishna tells Shivnath Shastri that it is misleading to think that Europe is not spiritual. They are spiritual. And the other person who disputes this is Brahmabandhu. He says that we can further enhance the idea of Vedantic unity from learning for what the West has to tell us. So this is not something which, this is an argument which Parthacharyya doesn't seem to take into account. He seems to believe that there is a very sharp divide between the inner and the outer, but I have found at least two instances where this dichotomy is questioned by Indians themselves. So this partly answers your question about whether inner domain is at all touched by the Western discourse. I think the answer is both yes and no. To an extent, it is, in the sense that the fact that reformers of the 19th century begin to believe that the status of women in society reflects the state of condition of a society is something which they borrow from the Western discourse, surely. But from the late 19th century onwards, I think especially after 1870s and 1880s, there is not so much a going back on women-related reform as to determine very carefully what kind of reform one needs. The opposition to widow remarried Christian is enormous. And even people like Gurudev and Bonkin are absolutely against the idea of widow remarriage. And Vivekananda himself, I have to admit, if you read Vivekananda, he doesn't approve of widow marriages. So there are these tensions within the Indian discourse of this period that we have to think a little more carefully about. Whether unity in diversity is an appropriated value from colonial construction, I'm not sure, because I think the idea of there being an overarching unity within the cultural diversity of India begins as early as Ram Mohan, where I think Vincent Smith doesn't figure. I think Vincent Smith comes much later. There is this, if you read carefully into the texts of early and mid-19th century, there is this feeling that, colonialists are unnecessarily trying to see us as a divided society. Our divisions are there, but our divisions are of a different order from what the West imagines these to be. That kind of an argument is always there. So I'm not too sure, and one has to look carefully into this question. About the question that you raised about jati, I don't think I use jati in a multiple sense. It's used in a multiple sense in the Bengali language. The word jati doesn't simply mean caste in Bangla. I don't know whether this is true of other languages. Jati also means a nation. There is in Calcutta a place called Mohajati Shabad. And here the word jati is not caste at all. It's a nation, it's a community, or a greater community. So it has a resonance of being used in a multiple way. And I think the point that I'm making here is this, that Indians used to make this argument repeatedly that jati should not be confused with caste. It also stands for other building blocks of the community. Sorry?
Varna is the term that is used for caste.
I'm not too sure. I hope there is a sociologist among us. So I think we ought to make a distinction between Varna and Jati. Varna is perhaps not present today. Varna is out of picture today. I think that should end the discussion.
Sir, one thing, the Swamiji warned us against the blind imitation of the West, but we started doing so. And that must have some impact, or maybe the major impact in forming our community. You said that Western impact on our nation building or community building is almost nil.
I don't think I said that. Swamiji, I have to say in response to your question, may have warned us against blind imitation of the West, but he was also a person deeply inspired.
Bartaman Bharat, the whole entire book is on that.
I'm aware about him. In fact, the interesting thing is, if I'm not incorrect, Swamiji is the first person to write a book on something like modern India. I don't think anybody else wrote on that. Bankim writes on Bengal. Buddha writes on Bengal. Other people of eminence write on Bengal. I think Shamiti, as Professor Bhattacharya was pointing out yesterday, last evening, that Shamiti is the first person to think of, envision India as a unity. And which is why I think he writes what he writes. And he writes Prachya or Paschat. He is also comparing the two, the Orient and the Occident. So, no, I am not suggesting that
There's the role of the West, of Europe.
the role of Europe on India is, I think, Vivekananda may have warned us against blind imitation, but I have to say that he was also deeply influenced by the West. A lot of his values and ideas and arguments are taken from the Western philosophical discourse, Western political experiences, which he tried to bring here selectively, I think, not blindly.
You wanted to avoid only blind imitation. Constructively learn the things. Don't blindly expose
He
it.
didn't wish to imitate
We
anything.
have also doing so. You know that
Thank you. I think this is one of the issues which we could take up again in the roundtable discussion which will take place tomorrow in the afternoon. We are slightly behind time.